It was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it belonged in a postcard. Wide streets, lined with stately oak trees, manicured lawns that seemed to bloom in perfect harmony, and friendly neighbors who exchanged pleasantries while tending to their gardens. The residents of Maple Ridge prided themselves on keeping everything in order, as if every blade of grass and freshly painted fence was a reflection of their collective pride. But even in a place that felt like it had no secrets, change was in the air. It all started the day Karen moved in. The protagonist, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, watched from their window as a moving truck pulled up to the house at the end of the block. There was nothing particularly special about the house, a two-story colonial with a neat porch and a neat little garden, though nothing compared to the pristine lawns of the rest of the block. But it was the way Karen carried herself that caught the protagonist's eye, her sharp, decisive movements, her air of superiority. She was already inspecting her new property as if she had been there for years. There was something about her that just didn't sit right. The neighbors had whispered about her even before she arrived. A lawyer from out of state, they'd heard, making a fresh start after a messy divorce. But it wasn't just her past that made people uneasy. It was the way she didn't quite fit in. She didn't smile when she waved at others, and she seemed to avoid eye contact with anyone who came too close. Instead, she simply looked down at them, as if they weren't worth the time. But the most unsettling thing was the way she didn't seem to care about the rules. As the truck unloaded her belongings, the protagonist noticed something strange. The large, rusted van she drove was parked directly in front of someone else's driveway, blocking the path. No one else dared to say anything. Most residents were too polite, too unwilling to confront anyone, especially a newcomer. But the protagonist knew better. They had spent years living by the strict rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, and they took these rules seriously. It wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about maintaining the identity of the neighborhood. No one was above the rules. It wasn't until that evening, just after sunset, that the first real sign of trouble appeared. Karen's car, still parked in the driveway, remained there as the sun dipped behind the horizon. A faint sound of loud music drifted over from her direction. The neighbor next door glanced out their window, their eyebrows furrowed. The noise was growing louder, and they could see the flicker of lights, strange, neon-colored lights, shining through the curtains of Karen's living room. The protagonist shook their head. This was just the beginning. Karen hadn't even been in the neighborhood for 24 hours, and already she was making waves. And for the first time in years, the protagonist could sense that something was about to break in Maple Ridge. The peace they had fought so hard to maintain was about to shatter, and Karen was the catalyst. It wasn't a question of if she would break the rules. It was a question of when. And when she did, the protagonist would be ready. It wasn't long before the first clear violation occurred, and when it did, it was as if a crack appeared in the perfect facade of Maple Ridge, a crack that would only grow wider with time. The sun had barely risen when the protagonist first noticed Karen's car in the same spot. A deep burgundy sedan parked directly in front of someone else's driveway. It wasn't a huge offense, but it was a violation of the neighborhood's parking rules. The HOA had strict guidelines about where residents could park, especially on such a narrow street, where blocking a driveway could cause problems. It was an unspoken rule. No one needed to say anything because everyone knew the code. But Karen didn't seem to care. The protagonist stood by their window, watching the car. The shadow of unease grew heavier. They knew that if this was allowed to slide, it would only be the first of many violations. The HOA had been vigilant for years, keeping the grass trimmed, the houses in good condition, and the cars parked properly. It was the backbone of the neighborhood's reputation. And here was Karen, testing the system within hours of moving in. By mid-afternoon, the car was still there, parked in front of the driveway, seemingly without a care. The protagonist hesitated, watching her from behind the blinds, debating whether to speak up. Should they confront her, or should they let the HOA handle it? But something about the way Karen moved around her house told them it wouldn't be that easy. She was already aware of the rules. She had to be. But Karen didn't look like someone who followed rules. She looked like someone who was ready to challenge them. The moment of hesitation was broken when Karen walked out of her house, her phone pressed to her ear as she strutted across the yard. The protagonist watched her, their stomach tightening with the familiar sense of dread. Then she did something that made their blood run cold. Karen threw a look in the direction of the protagonist's house, an arrogant, almost mocking gaze that lasted only a second. It was enough. In that fleeting moment, the protagonist realized Karen wasn't just unaware of the rules. She was taunting them. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she didn't care. The protagonist's heart raced. This was bigger than a simple parking violation. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint, thumping bass began to pulse through the air. The music was loud, louder than anything the neighborhood had ever tolerated, and there was no mistaking it. It was coming from Karen's house. She was having a party. And judging by the cars already parked along the street, it wasn't going to be a small one. The neighbors gathered in their front yards, exchanging uneasy glances. Some whispered about calling the police, while others looked to the protagonist. Everyone was waiting for someone to take the first step. But the protagonist knew this wasn't just a noisy party. This was defiance. Karen had already crossed the line with the parking violation, but this was a bold statement. She was telling the neighborhood that she was above the rules, that no one could stop her. The protagonist stood frozen, watching the lights flash through Karen's windows, the bass of the music thundering like a drumbeat in their chest. The pressure of the situation mounted as more neighbors gathered on their porches, exchanging murmurs of disbelief. There was only one thing left to do now: confront her. But as the protagonist stepped toward their door, something held them back. A strange feeling that this wasn't just the first violation. This was a signal, a clear message from Karen that she wasn't going to be easily intimidated or swayed. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was daring everyone to stop her. The following morning, the tension in Maple Ridge was palpable. The sun was barely up, yet the stillness that once defined the neighborhood had been replaced by an uneasy quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. It wasn't just the music or the parking violation. It was everything that Karen was doing. And now, the neighborhood knew the truth. Karen wasn't just a new neighbor who needed to adjust to the rules. She was testing them, challenging the very foundation that kept this neighborhood together. The protagonist stood in their kitchen, staring out the window. Across the street, Karen's house was just as they had left it the night before, disheveled, with empty bottles littering the yard and cigarette butts snuffed out on the front steps. The morning light revealed the damage of her reckless party. Broken beer cans and empty cups scattered across the lawn like a battlefield. The protagonist felt their hands tighten around their coffee cup. This wasn't just an accident. She was doing this on purpose. The neighbors began to gather on the streets, their expressions wary. Some of them exchanged knowing glances, others stayed in their homes, peeking nervously through curtains. The community had never seen this kind of audacity before. No one wanted to be the first to complain. No one wanted to be the one to stir the pot. But the longer Karen pushed the boundaries, the more people began to talk, to wonder who would step forward. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the noise or the mess. It was the attitude. Karen wasn't here to fit in. She was here to make a statement. And every day that passed without any consequences, that statement grew louder. The neighbors were beginning to notice too. In hushed voices, they exchanged their concerns. "I can't believe she just parked in front of my driveway," one neighbor muttered. "And did you see the way she glared at me when I asked her to move her car? Like I was the one in the wrong." The protagonist listened carefully, but all they could feel was the gnawing anxiety in their stomach. The truth was clear. If someone didn't step up and stop Karen now, things were only going to get worse. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, a place where neighbors looked out for one another. But now it felt like a battleground. Who would take the first step? The protagonist's mind raced. They knew that HOA had a system in place for these kinds of violations, but would it be enough to stop Karen? The more they thought about it, the more they realized they couldn't afford to wait. The HOA was an abstract force, distant and bureaucratic. But they, the protagonist, were here, in the heart of the neighborhood. And if no one else would do something about Karen, then it was up to them. But confronting Karen directly wasn't going to be easy. There was something unsettling in the way she carried herself, her calm confidence, her refusal to back down. The way she looked at the protagonist yesterday, as though daring them to challenge her. She was playing a dangerous game, and she knew it. The protagonist took a deep breath and stepped outside, walking slowly toward the street. Their eyes never left Karen's house. As they reached the sidewalk, a sudden thought struck them. What if it wasn't just Karen who needed to be stopped? What if her arrival was the beginning of something bigger? As the days dragged on, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking beneath the surface of Karen's provocations. It wasn't just the noise, the parking violations, or the blatant disregard for the rules. It was her. There was a coldness to Karen that unsettled the protagonist in ways they couldn't fully understand. She didn't just break the rules. She did so with a purpose, as if trying to expose the very vulnerabilities of the neighborhood, testing where the limits were. Karen's actions were deliberate, and she seemed to be constantly provoking people into reacting. The protagonist needed answers. What was driving her? They began by talking to the few neighbors who had dared approach Karen, those who had tried to be friendly, only to be met with a cold stare or an abrupt dismissal. But no one had much to offer. She just moved here, one neighbor muttered, clearly uncomfortable. Not much to say about her, except she doesn't seem to care about anything. Frustrated but undeterred, the protagonist decided to dig deeper. They took to the online forums where local residents exchanged information, posting questions in the local community groups about Karen's background. It didn't take long before a familiar name popped up, Karen Michaels. The information was sparse, but enough to send a chill through the protagonist's spine. A few searches later, they uncovered an article about a woman with the same name involved in a contentious lawsuit over a similar situation in another neighborhood. The details were murky, but one thing was clear. Karen had a reputation for causing chaos wherever she went. It wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence. She had done this before. The article described how Karen had been involved in a dispute over an HOA's regulations in her former neighborhood, where she had purposefully violated every rule imaginable. Noise complaints, illegal construction, and parking violations had piled up until the HOA was forced to take her to court. The case was ultimately settled out of court, but the damage to the community was lasting. Her departure had left the neighborhood shaken, its residents bitter and distrustful of any newcomers who might bring the same type of turmoil. So this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't a woman who needed time to adjust. This was a woman who thrived on creating conflict, on undermining authority, and bending every rule to her will. The protagonist's stomach tightened as the realization hit. Karen wasn't just breaking the rules. She was playing a game, and everyone around her was a pawn. As the protagonist pieced together this chilling portrait of Karen, something else struck them. Karen wasn't just trying to break the neighborhood's rules. She was trying to break its spirit. She wasn't just seeking to undermine the HOA's authority. She was trying to tear apart the unity that had held this peaceful community together for so long. The more the protagonist thought about it, the more it seemed that Karen had chosen Maple Ridge because it was the perfect target. A tight-knit community, known for its pride in its rules and order. But now, everything was at stake. The protagonist knew that this wasn't just a matter of one person breaking the rules. This was a deliberate attempt to destabilize the entire neighborhood, and it was working. The tension was palpable, the cracks in the community growing wider every day. Neighbors were beginning to eye each other with suspicion, unsure who might be next to buckle under Karen's pressure. The following evening, the tension in Maple Ridge reached a boiling point. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the unease in the neighborhood seemed to grow with each passing minute. The protagonist stood at their front door, taking in the scene. Lights flickered in the distance. Karen's house, once again alive with noise. This time, however, it wasn't just the bass of music thumping through the walls. It was the sharp, shrill laughter of a dozen voices. A gathering was underway. It was time. The protagonist had spent days weighing their options, gathering evidence, and piecing together the dark truth about Karen's intentions. They had tried to be patient, hoping someone else would step up, but it was clear now, no one would. The community had fractured under Karen's weight. People were afraid to speak out, afraid of being targeted next. They were waiting for someone to do something, but no one seemed willing to be the first to act. That responsibility, uncomfortably, fell to the protagonist. With a deep breath, they stepped outside, their heart pounding in their chest. The cool night air only heightened the urgency of the moment. They walked with determination down the sidewalk, their eyes never leaving Karen's house. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was bracing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. When they reached the front gate of Karen's property, the music grew louder, more garish, but the protagonist didn't flinch. They knew what they had to do. The moment Karen appeared in the doorway, framed by the harsh glow of party lights, the protagonist spoke. "Karen," they called, their voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." For a moment, Karen didn't respond. She merely stood there, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a half-smile. She knew exactly why the protagonist was here. And for the first time since the protagonist had met her, she didn't seem surprised, just entertained. "You've been causing a lot of problems around here," the protagonist continued, their words cold and direct. "Violating parking rules, hosting loud parties, disrespecting the HOA's guidelines. It needs to stop." Karen's smirk deepened, and she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the concrete. She met the protagonist's gaze with an unsettling confidence, as though she were sizing them up. "Oh, you think I'm the problem?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You and your precious little rules. Let's see how well they hold up when you really start digging. You think you've got me cornered, don't you?" The words hit harder than the protagonist expected, but they pressed on, unwilling to back down. "This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who lives here. We've built a community based on respect for each other and the rules that keep us all safe. And I won't let you tear that apart." For a moment, there was silence. A flicker of something passed through Karen's eyes, a flash of irritation, perhaps even fear. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that cold, mocking smile. "Respect," she repeated, her voice low. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Before the protagonist could respond, Karen stepped back, turning her back with an exaggerated sigh. "Fine, do what you have to do. Call the HOA. Call the police. But don't come crying to me when it all falls apart. You're all just too easy to manipulate. And when I'm done here, you'll all be begging me to leave." The words sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. There it was, the truth. Karen wasn't just here to live. She was here to break everyone around her. And she wasn't going to stop until she had destroyed everything in her path. The protagonist stood frozen for a heartbeat, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Karen thought she was untouchable. But that was exactly the mistake she was making. The night air was thick with tension, the echoes of Karen's taunting words still ringing in the protagonist's ears as they stood frozen at the foot of her porch. In that fleeting moment of confrontation, Karen's mockery had left them rattled, but it also solidified something deeper within the protagonist's resolve. This wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood, about standing up to someone who thought they could break everyone's spirit without consequences. Karen had miscalculated. And now, it was time to make her feel the full force of the community she had tried to manipulate. Without another word, the protagonist turned on their heel and marched back toward their home. But as they reached the door, they didn't stop. They grabbed their phone and began typing out a message to the HOA board. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a declaration. They outlined every single violation Karen had committed in the past week. The parking issues, the noise complaints, the constant disruptions, and attached the evidence they'd gathered. No more waiting. No more hoping someone else would step up. The message was sent. As they sat there, waiting for a response, the weight of their decision began to sink in. This was it. There would be no going back now. Karen had pushed everyone to their limit, and they had finally decided to fight back. Hours passed before the HOA board finally responded, their message blunt but firm. We are aware of the situation. Rest assured, action will be taken immediately. A surge of satisfaction coursed through the protagonist. For the first time, they felt in control of the situation. But as they let the phone slip from their hand onto the table, another thought lingered. Karen hadn't shown any signs of backing down. In fact, she had only become more dangerous, more unpredictable. If the HOA moved against her, there was no telling how she might retaliate. The following day, an eerie quiet settled over the neighborhood. The music had stopped, the cars parked where they should be, and for the first time in days, there was no sign of Karen's disruption. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. Had Karen finally backed down? Or was this her way of plotting something bigger? By afternoon, the answer came in the form of a letter. It was hand-delivered by a courier, sealed in an envelope marked with Karen's name. The protagonist opened it with a sense of dread. To whom it may concern, the letter began in elegant script. It seems my efforts have not been understood. You see, I'm not just any resident in your quaint little neighborhood. I'm the one who will expose all the cracks that you've so carefully hidden from the world. The rules you all cling to like a crutch. They're just a smokescreen for the real problems beneath. I will show you what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The letter was signed simply, Karen Michaels. A cold shiver ran down the protagonist's spine. This was no longer a simple dispute about rules. This was war. And Karen wasn't planning on losing. The next few days passed in a tense, almost unbearable silence. The once bustling neighborhood was now eerily quiet. The music had stopped, the parties had ceased, and the streets that had been plagued with Karen's reckless disregard for the rules were now pristine, almost unnervingly so. It was as if Karen had suddenly vanished, leaving nothing but a cold void in her wake. But the protagonist couldn't shake the sense that something much darker was brewing beneath the surface. Every corner of Maple Ridge seemed to be watching and waiting, as though the very air itself held its breath. The neighbors, once suspicious of each other, now exchanged uneasy glances when they saw the protagonist outside. Whispers filled the air about Karen's cryptic letter and the threats it contained. Many of them were too afraid to speak openly, but the fear was palpable. They had seen her power to manipulate, her ability to turn the simplest issues into a full-blown crisis. And yet, Karen wasn't making any moves, at least none that were visible. The protagonists spent their evenings watching Karen's house from a distance, their pulse quickening each time they saw a shadow move behind the drawn curtains. What was she planning? Why was she so silent? Was she really laying low, or was she simply waiting for the right moment to strike? It wasn't until late one night that the answers started to reveal themselves. The protagonist had just finished a late dinner when a sharp, unsettling knock echoed through their door. They froze, heart racing, before reluctantly opening it. Standing there, bathed in the dim light from the porch, was a man in a crisp suit, holding an envelope. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. The protagonist nodded cautiously. "This is for you," the man said, handing over the envelope before turning and walking briskly down the steps. Inside the envelope, the protagonist found another letter, this one more formal, yet every bit as chilling as the last. "You have no idea what you're up against. I hope you've prepared yourself. I'll see you soon, And when I do, you'll regret making me your enemy. The signature, Karen Michaels. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. This wasn't just some petty threat anymore. This was war, and Karen had made it personal. The next morning, the HOA finally responded to the mounting pressure. A notice appeared on every resident's doorstep, declaring that Karen's case had been escalated. The HOA would hold a special meeting, and if Karen refused to comply with their demands, further legal action would be taken. The residents, though relieved to hear something was being done, were still uneasy. The storm was building, but no one knew how fierce it would get once it broke. The protagonist, however, knew something that the rest didn't. Karen wasn't going to stop with just a legal battle. She was playing the long game, and she was about to make her move. Later that evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, the protagonist caught a glimpse of Karen standing on her front lawn. This time, she wasn't smirking. She wasn't even looking in their direction. She stood still, staring at the horizon as if lost in thought. But the air around her seemed to crackle with a barely contained energy, as if she were waiting for something, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The storm finally broke on a cool, crisp morning, just as the protagonist had feared. The tension that had been building for weeks seemed to crack open, sending a wave of chaos rippling through Maple Ridge. The neighborhood had been holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, and now it had arrived. The protagonist awoke to the sound of sirens in the distance, loud, insistent, and getting closer. A few seconds later, there was a knock at the door. They swung it open to find two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious. "Are you the homeowner?" one officer asked. "Yes." "What's going on?" The protagonist's heart rate spiked, sensing the gravity of the situation. "We've received a complaint from a resident of this neighborhood," the officer said. "A disturbance involving your property. We're going to need to come inside and investigate." Before the protagonist could respond, the officers were already moving past them, into the house, as if they were already convinced of guilt. Something was wrong. A wave of dread washed over the protagonist, a sinking feeling that this was Karen's doing. Another one of her manipulations, a way to force the neighborhood's hand. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. As the officers scoured the house, they found nothing. The protagonist had done nothing wrong, but there was no denying the sense of urgency in their eyes. The officers were already receiving calls. Karen had filed an official complaint, accusing the protagonist of being a threat to the peace and safety of the community. The police had to act, even if they didn't believe the accusations for a second. The protagonist's blood ran cold. This was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. Karen had escalated things far beyond anything they could have imagined. And this time, she was using the law as her weapon. As the officers left, the protagonist's phone buzzed. It was a message from the HOA. "We are aware of the complaint. Immediate action is being taken. We recommend you prepare for a hearing." In the hours that followed, it became clear that Karen had executed her final move. The HOA had no choice but to call an emergency meeting to address the complaint. It wasn't just about the parking violations anymore. Karen had framed the protagonist as a threat, someone who was destabilizing the community. The entire neighborhood was now caught in her web. The protagonist raced to the meeting, their mind racing with everything they had learned about Karen. How she thrived on chaos, how she manipulated everyone around her into doing her bidding. But now, the protagonist wasn't the only one in her sights. She had ensnared the whole community, and the stakes had never been higher. When the protagonist arrived at the HOA building, they were greeted with a crowd of tense faces. Neighbors, all of them with anxious eyes fixed on the door. Karen sat at the front of the room, calm, composed, and smug. She had played them all, and now it was their turn to decide who would win. The meeting began, and the accusations flew fast and thick. The HOA, its board members, and the residents were all torn between belief and skepticism. Karen's charm was her weapon, but the protagonist was ready to expose the truth. They had gathered everything: The research, the proof of Karen's manipulations, the countless violations, and they weren't going to back down. As the meeting reached its peak, Karen stood, her eyes glittering with confidence. "You think you've won. You think you've uncovered the truth." She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You're just as blind as they all are. You can't stop me." The final twist came when the protagonist presented the last piece of evidence, Karen's previous court case. The truth spilled out like a floodgate opening, and the room fell silent. Karen's carefully constructed persona shattered before their eyes. Climax. The room erupted in shock, whispers turning into stunned silence. Karen's smirk faltered, and the once confident villain suddenly looked vulnerable. The HOA voted unanimously to evict her. Her reign of chaos was over. But as she was escorted out, Karen turned, her eyes burning with fury. "You may have won this round," she spat, "but you haven't seen the last of me."